Come to the party. Our third week of this series, Come to the Party, and you know in the first week we talked about RSVPing to the party. It's not just about being invited to the party. To be party people, you have to respond. You have to come to the party. And so when we initially began this series of Come to the Party, we talked about party people. And then last week we talked about party presents. We looked at the magi, those magi from the east that came and brought gifts. And we realized that when you truly bring presents to the party, what's most important is that you're present, that you have presence at the party. And the magi taught us that coming to the party leads to being present at the party. And then as you it was alluded to this morning in a little over-the-top way, that we are talking about the purpose of the party today. The purpose of the party, any party, the Jesus party, the birthday party, any party, the purpose of that party is celebration. And so we have come to this party. We are preparing a party where its purpose is to celebrate. Why else would you have a party if you weren't going to celebrate that party? And so today we want to focus on a party 28 generations before Jesus. So this was Jesus' great to the 26th power. Jesus' great, 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 great granddad. We're talking about David. See, David was part of a party. And his party is recorded in 2 Samuel chapter 6. And what this party is not the Jesus party, it's the Ark party. And see, what the Ark party was that for a long time, there's some people say 25 years, to others say 75 years, that the Ark of the Lord, the Ark of the Covenant, had been missing. And David decided, after being appointed king of Israel, that he was going to bring the Ark back to Jerusalem, back to its home. And so I want to share with you the Ark party today, because I believe the Ark party has amazing foreshadowing to the Jesus party. Now, in order to understand the Ark party, we got to understand the Ark. And so I want to share with you some information about the Ark. And then you'll begin to see, as the service and the message goes on, how it so easily parallels to Jesus. As Jerome read in verse 3, the Ark was called the name of the Lord Almighty. Exodus 24 tells us that there was a covenant between Jehovah, which was a proper name for God. So his name was Jehovah, Yahweh in the Hebrew, and the people of God. And they made this covenant, they made this agreement. And what this agreement started off with was that they were supposed to make a box. They were supposed to make an ark that was going to house the presence of God. It says in Exodus 25:22, they are above the cover between the two cherubim that are over the ark of the covenant law. I will meet with you and give you all my commands for the Israelites. And so God is saying, listen, the way we're going to do this, the way we're going to have this relationship between me and you is that we're going to build this ark, this box, that is 4 feet by 2.5 feet by 2.5 feet. And where the ark is, my presence will be. And so the first instructions they have about this covenant is to build this ark, this box of acacia wood. And they're supposed to put a golden cover over it, which is called the mercy seat. And they're supposed to put two kind of angelic beings on the top of it. They're called cherubim. And they're going to have these poles so that it can be carried. And it symbolizes God's presence. Now, we know a little bit, because I share a lot about the Israelites. We know that the Israelites weren't always the model citizens for God. And so through their ungodliness and through their disobedience, the ark was stolen by the enemy. And so it wasn't simply just your family heirloom that got stolen, or this relic, this ancient relic that got stolen, or it wasn't simply just this beautiful treasure that got stolen. No, when the ark was stolen, the presence of God withdrew from the people. And so where the ark was, the presence of God was. And so when the ark wasn't present with the Israelites, God wasn't present with the Israelites. God's presence wasn't with the Israelites. And so they had just gone through 6 or 7 decades worth of the lack of presence, the withdrawn presence of God. And so we see David has this desire to bring the ark back to Jerusalem. To bring it back, he has this desire to return, to recognize the ark as truly the power and the presence of God with the people of God. Now that sounds like a good reason for a party, right? The presence of God had not been with you for 60 years, and the king, who's in his right mind, who has a love for God, says, I'm going to bring the presence of God back to where it belongs. See, David realized that if he re-identified or reaffirmed that God's presence was the people's only hope, that if the people of Israel were going to have hope, they must have the presence of God with them. And so he realized that, and so he went the 10 miles to try to retrieve the ark. And so before he went, he prepared this special tent so that when the ark got back, it could be housed in this appropriate place until the planned temple was completed. And then David gets 30,000 men. I mean, come on, 30,000? He gets the entire Brooke County plus a little bit. And he says, hey, listen, we're going to go down this 10-mile track and we're going to get the presence of God. We're going to get this ark and we're going to bring it back and we're going to have a party as we travel. David chooses 30,000. It was military and priestly to celebrate the homecoming of the ark. And it says in verse 5 that David and the whole house of Israel were celebrating with all their might. It was an ark party. They were singing and playing many instruments. And so they began out on this journey and they're bringing the ark back. They have it in their possession. But all of a sudden, there's a commotion. Now there's 30,000 people, so you don't know exactly where it's coming from. But it looks like it's right by where the ark was being driven. And all of a sudden, word gets to David that someone has died. Now, it was this guy whose name is Uzzah. He was the grandson of Abinadab, where the ark had been hanging out for the last 20 years. And what had happened is that they had put the ark, the presence of God, on a new cart. And this cart was being pulled by these oxen, and one of the oxen stumbled, and the ark began to fall, and Uzzah was flagged for unnecessary use of hands. He touched the ark. I don't know if it was because he was too familiar or he had forgotten, but he had certainly not remembered Numbers chapter 4. Verse 15, it said, after Aaron and his sons, the Levites, have finished covering the holy furnishings and all the holy articles, and when the camp is ready to move, only then are the Kohathites to come and do the carrying. But they must not touch the holy things, or they will die. See, there was only one group of people. There was only one family that was able to touch the holy things. They were the Levites. And Uzzah was not a Levite. And so it didn't matter if the ark was about to fall, it was not supposed to be touched by anybody but a Levite. And so Uzzah touches it and he immediately dies. See, what we realize is that it's never a good thing to forget what God has said. When God has spoken about something, we must hear what he said, regardless of what other people say. Now, David, in preparation for bringing the ark back, had talked to many people, many political and many military leaders to try to decide how to make this 10-mile journey, but he didn't remember what God had said, how you carry this ark back. And so when Uzzah reaches out, he only had to reach out because it was on a cart. It was never intended to ever be on a cart. Remember how I told you how it was built? It was built with poles. It was built to be carried by the Levites, never to be put on a cart. And so what happens after this is that this man loses his life, and now David is upset, and he's angry at God, and he's fearful at God, and he says, I don't know if we're ever going to make the rest of this journey. Maybe they were a couple miles into the journey. And he didn't realize that you know what, this isn't working out very well. I still have 8 miles to go. I don't know what to do. Actually, you know what I'm going to do? I'm just going to drop the ark off at Obed-Edom's house. He's a Levite. Maybe it'll just be safekeeping there. And so it says in the scriptures that he drops the ark off at Obed-Edom's house, and it's 3 months that David does nothing with the ark. Now, during this 3 months, I bet he went back to the scriptures and realized the error of his ways. He realized that God was very clear that no one but the Levites were to carry this ark. He realized that he had done sin, that he had needed to confess something, he needed to learn something. But also he realized that God was blessing Obed-Edom. See, while the ark, the presence of God, was in the house of Obed-Edom, there was tremendous blessing on that house, tremendous favor on that house. And so David is trying to decide, wait a minute, a guy just lost his life in relation to the ark. And now this family, this man, an average, ordinary man, is being blessed because the ark is in his presence. What is the difference? And David realizes that Obed-Edom has favor because he is handling the ark appropriately. Church, friends, just like the Israelites, there are times in our lives where we are falling away from God. We are forgetting the ways and the means of God. I mean, that's what basically the Israelites, they didn't remember how to treat the ark, the presence of God. They had become unfamiliar with how to handle the presence of God, and they had drifted away. And their drifting caused them to worship other things. And God had chosen a man named David to call the nation back to its first love, call the nation back to the presence of God, to the ark that represented the presence of God. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm sure that there were points in my life before I came to Christ that I was far from his presence. I was far from the ark. But that's the wonderful thing about Christmas and about the Jesus party. It calls us back for the purpose of celebrating the one who Isaiah calls Emmanuel, God with us. The presence of God. See, what the ark symbolized for the Israelites, Jesus personifies for us. What the ark represented and symbolized, that when we are with the ark, when we were in the presence of the ark, the presence of God is with us. Church, when we talk about Christmas, when we talk about coming to the party, we're talking about receiving Jesus. We're talking about being in the presence of the one true God, Emmanuel, with us. See, through Jesus, we have access to the Father. Through the ark, the Israelites had access to the Father. See, David's celebration, the purpose of the party, demonstrated his understanding and appreciation of God's presence returning and coming into his home. See, that's why David was so excited, because he realized what the presence of God with him meant. He appreciated what the presence of God with him meant. David knew that Israel could only realize their fullness as a nation in proportion to how much they realized God's presence returning and coming to their house. Church, that's what Christmas is. The greater that we appreciate, the greater that we realize, the greater that we receive God's presence, the greater fullness we'll have in our life. See, the presence of Christ at the party makes it the party. Unless Jesus comes to the party, it's not a party at all. Unless the ark was part of the party, it wasn't a party at all. That 3 months that David had been waiting on what to do next with the ark, there was no celebrating. There was no dancing. There was no shouting. There was no instruments playing because they were not in the presence of God. And once he realized that it was the presence of God that was the purpose for his celebration, the trip to Jerusalem continued. So they had been there. Uzzah dies. They take a 3-month break. Obed-Edom is blessed because of the presence and favor of God in his home. And then David shows back up in verse 8 and says, let's try this again. And what he does is he begins again after being angry and fearful and releasing the ark to Obed-Edom. He takes a 3-month break, but now he comes back and he's humbled. He realizes that the purpose of the party is to celebrate. And I want to show you a few things through this passage that really highlight party purposes. So if you're sleeping, you want to wake up. Because we're talking about the purpose of the party. The purpose of the party is celebration. And we see the purpose of the party demonstrated first through David's clothing. David's clothing, he says it has a linen ephod on. And basically this is like an apron type garment that was normally reserved for priests and to demonstrate humility. This was far less glamorous than the royal kingly robes that David would wear. David was saying, listen, the purpose of this party is not to be a king. The purpose of this party is to worship and celebrate the presence of God. And so I'm going to lay aside my kingly robe, and I'm going to put on a garment, I'm going to put on a clothing that demonstrates the purpose of this party. I'm a commoner. I'm the lead worshiper today. I want to be dressed modestly, certainly not obscenely. But David's dress was different and unpredictable for kings. Who said following God should be predictable? Who said a relationship with God should be the same? David said, no. The purpose of this party is to be different and unpredictable. So David's clothing was a purpose of the party. Number two, David's actions and his actions were a purpose of the party. It says in verse 14 that he was dancing. The Hebrew here is only used in this passage. The word that he uses is only used twice in the entire Old Testament, and both of them are in this passage. And what it means is to dance in a circle. That's what David was doing. He was so excited about being in the presence of God and having that presence of God return to his home. He was just dancing in a circle because he was so excited about what God had done in his life. That God had chosen him. That God desired to be with him. So not only was it his clothing, but it was his actions. He set aside the royal garb that was expected of him. Maybe, church, sometimes we put in place how we feel like other people should want us to worship. Maybe we put in place what we think how everyone celebrates Christmas. Well, you could never have a piñata at the church. I have been to 71 Christmas services for 71 years, and there's never been a piñata. I've never, ever celebrated Christmas with a leaf blower with toilet paper blown out of it. We can't do it that way. That's not how it's done. David is saying, listen, I'm going to worship in a way that's unpredictable. David's clothing, David's actions. Number three, David's intensity. The Bible says that David danced with all of his might. When's the last time you and I did something with all of our might? When's the last time you and I, Lori's like, I did something, I jumped out of a plane. I did it with all my might. But church, think about that for a second. The clothing, the actions, the intensity at which David went after his celebration. Church, we gotta reckon with that. I'm certainly not trying to I am certainly not trying to espouse a certain type of worship here. See, I know that so often we fall into this ditch of, oh, you just want us to yell and scream at church. You just want us to raise our... No. We're way, way, way above that. We're not talking about conservative, Pentecostal, this. We're talking about authentic. We're talking about doing something with all of our might. God made your personality the way He wanted it to be. And if He wanted you to be an extrovert, He'd have made you an extrovert. If He wanted you to be an introvert, He'd have made you an introvert. But that's no excuse for not worshiping God. Your personality is not a liability to God. And it's not an excuse not to worship. And it's not an excuse not to do something with all of your might. What all of your might be is different than what all of my might be. But guess what? We all have a desire to have the intensity of David. His clothing, his actions, his intensity, and fourthly, his attitude. Undignified. Are you even allowed to say that word in church? Undignified. This is in the Bible, friends. It says that David was undignified. He was free. He was spontaneous. He was extravagant. Like the kids like to say this day, he was 100. I just went there. Did I just go there? I just went there. See, it's the opposite, church, of predictable and conservative and less than and predetermined. David had radical obedience that resulted in his experiencing and expressing great joy. So when we see David dancing in a circle, what we're seeing is the result of something that happened on the inside of him that was consistent with his personality. These are all party purposes. His clothing, his actions, his intensity, his attitude of this undignified attitude. But David also had another factor in the purpose of his party. David had haters. You got haters? David had a hater. It was his first wife. Michal was actually the prize for David killing Goliath. So if you remember the David and Goliath story, that Saul said, anyone who can kill this giant, I will give my daughter to. Well, this is her. And see, she loved David, the mighty warrior. She loved David, the one that was slaying his 10,000s. She wasn't really down with the worshiping David. She wasn't down with the David that set aside the royalty to get humble before God. It says that David's hater, Michal, was watching from the window. Isn't that interesting? Aren't always the haters in the window? The haters are always in the window. They're always far enough away to not be involved. They're always far enough away to not know what's going on. They're far enough away to not be having the experience. The hater was in the window. At a distance. You know that what cuts down on hating? Participating. You could tweet that. I just made that up. Here is Michal's view of a king. Kings don't mingle with the people. Kings are aloof. Kings are inaccessible. Well, guess what? There's a new king in town. He's very accessible. He's not aloof. And he wants to be in the middle of the people. And I'm not talking about David. I'm talking about Jesus. The ark was the presence of God. It was access, and David was celebrating. The birth of Jesus is Emmanuel, God with us, which is access. which is celebrating. I don't have a lot of time to share with you about 17, 18, and 19, but here's what I want to say about you. Go ahead and read that scripture. We didn't have Jerome read it just for the sake of time, but what happens in 17, 18, and 19 is one thing, and I need you to hear it because it's important, is one thing that haters hate and people that are in the game never realize fully. And here it is. David paid attention first to what God had told him to do and the people that were with him before he ever dealt with the hater. See, it says in verses 17, 18, and 19 that David went and he was very generous, and he says maybe he was a great chef. He made up all this bread and all this stuff, and all the people that were with him, that 30,000 that were with him, the 30,000 that were bringing the ark back to Jerusalem, they had a party. He saw Michal in the window. He saw that she was gritting on him and hating on him. But he focused first and foremost on the people that were with him. And he supplied their needs and he blessed them. Church, let the haters wait in line. Let the haters wait in line. They're going to be there. They're not going to change the way they think. Let us focus. Listen, I need to be sitting down for this one because this is hard for me too. I need to hear this. Let the haters wait in line and let us do that which God has called us to do and be unhindered in that. That's what David did. David focused on what God had called him to do and the people that God had brought him, and then he went in verse 20 to deal with the hater. And it says that when he showed up, he went home in verse 20 to bless his family. And it says that, this is the Bryce translation, that Michal was at the doorway, arms crossed, with a scowl on her face, saying something like, "You made a fool of yourself today. Don't you know who you are? You are the king, and we have a kingdom to run here. We don't got time for all this foolery. We've got to do what we've got to do. We've got to keep up our image. You should be ashamed of yourself. You were acting like a fool. Where are the clothes that I laid out for you this morning? Where did you find those rags you're wearing? You're embarrassing us, me." And David's response is beautiful. The first thing he says was, "I was before the Lord." See, Michal, you thought I was dancing so you could see me? I had an audience of one. I wasn't there for you. I wasn't there for you. I wasn't there for you or you. I was dancing before the Lord. I was before the Lord. I understood that God has chosen me. He has favored me more than he favored your father. And so the purpose of this party is to celebrate, because the one who has promoted and blessed me deserves this and more. He recognized as fully as was possible that no matter what, no matter who, no matter where, God is worthy to be praised. Amen? That's the purpose of the party. The purpose of the party is to praise God. And then I love it. He says, "Oh, and yeah, one more thing. I will become even more undignified than this. You thought what you saw was all there was? Wait till next week. You were offended by the toilet paper? Oh, please, Jesus, come next week." Church, David is pointing to something more. David's pointing to something that's coming. David's pointing to something beyond him. Maybe David was talking about the king of the world coming, born in a barn. Wait a minute. The king of the world. Not the king of Israel. We're talking about the king of the world. Born of a teenage virgin? In an animal stall? The only people witnessing are the lowest class of people? Was David talking about dying on a cross like a criminal? Rejected by the people that you came to save? There's nothing about Jesus that was dignified. Undignified. There was nothing about the Jesus story that's dignified. Everything about Jesus' story is undignified. There was nothing formal or stiff or predictable. Everything about this party is undignified. Everything about this party is unpredictable. So why wouldn't our purpose be undignified? Why wouldn't our purpose of the party be undignified? Our purpose, our celebration should be undignified as well. And let me just say, for those who think I'm tiptoeing real close to the line, I am aware that there's a line that becomes irreverent. I don't believe that David got this one wrong. There was a line between undignified and irreverent. But the story of David was a story of music and dancing. It was a story about putting away the robe and putting on the humble ephod. It was about putting away the pouting and taking up the shouting. I know I've said this to you before, but there's so many people that I want to say, are you a Christian? And they say, yes, I'm a Christian. Then tell your face. Do you have Jesus in your heart? Well, you better inform your face because you don't look like you have joy. David is unashamedly dancing before the Lord. If you and I would do one thing this Christmas unashamedly, what might it be? Honestly, if you said, you know what, just as a symbol of I get Pastor's message today, there is one thing I'm going to do this Christmas. Between now and next Monday, I'm going to do one thing all out. I'm going to do one thing undignified. I'm going to do one thing that shows that I'm going all the way with my relationship with Jesus. What might that be? Now, I realize because of your personalities, because of your way of life and your age and all these things, listen, those are all factors. They're not liabilities. So yours might look different than mine, but it doesn't allow us to not be worshipers. My prayer for you today is that your heart would be soft enough to love, humble enough to obey, and undignified enough to worship. Can we agree to that today? Can we agree that our hearts are going to be soft enough to love, humble enough to obey, and undignified enough to worship God at Christmas? All right, let's bring this in for a landing. C.S. Lewis, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Susan, the character, learns that the one whom they were about to meet, Aslan, was a lion. Uh-oh. I didn't realize he was a lion. Somewhat uncomfortable with this notion, she wondered if it was safe to meet Aslan. Mr. Beaver responds, "Who said anything about safe? Who said anything about safe? Of course he's not safe, but he's good. He's the king, I tell you. Who said anything about safe? Who said anything about predictable at Christmas? Who said anything about dignity? Everything about the Christmas story is undignified. Nothing about the Christmas story is safe. But he's good. And he's the king. Church, that's a real good purpose to party. The purpose of the party is to celebrate. John 15, 9 through 11, I alluded to it with the kids. As the Father has loved me, so I have loved you. This is in red letters in the Bible, so it's really important. As the Father has loved me, so I have loved you. Now remain in my love. If you keep my commands, you will remain in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commands and remain in his love. Verse 11, I have told you this so that my joy may be where? Jesus is saying he wants his joy in you. He didn't stop there. My joy in you, and that your joy may be complete. You know, one of the things that has been most difficult for me of this last year is joy. And one of the things that we're working on at our home is gratefulness. This may not be where we want it to be, but there's a whole lot over here to be grateful for. This might make us sad, but there is so much more to be joyful about. My Jesus tells me that he's going to make my joy complete. What's that look like? How can I not bring a smile to your face? Jesus said he's going to make your joy complete. The purpose of the party, friends, is to celebrate. It's to celebrate. We got one more week. I sure hope you come back next Sunday. The end of the party. It's the party. And we're going to focus on the person of the party. Amen? God is so good. He is so good. So good. So I want to conclude. Ask the worship team to come back. I want to ask you to stand with me. Stand up, and we're going to just stand as a way of exiting. And as we plan to exit, I want to simply just share with you briefly that the Ark of the Covenant had a couple other purposes. So not only was it the presence of God, but it was actually the place where the sacrifices were made over top of. And so there was this gold overlay. It was called the mercy seat. And this gold overlay didn't look very pretty. You want to know why it didn't look very pretty? It's because it had tons and tons and tons and tons of blood on it. Because the sacrifices were made over top of the ark. At the Holy of Holies, at the altar where the sacrifices are being made, the blood was sprinkled on the ark. And what that represented is that blood was the atonement. It was the payment for the sin. And so once a year, the high priest would go into the Holy of Holies one time a year. And it was so scary to go in, they would actually tie something around his ankle just in case he died, they could pull him out because they weren't allowed in. And so he would walk in one time a year and he would make a sacrifice and he would sprinkle the blood on top of the mercy seat of the ark. The reason why that's significant for us today is because the very thing they had then, we still have, and it's called sin. And there has to be a remedy for our sin. And so in the Old Testament, they sacrificed animals. In the New Testament, that baby that came, he died on a cross. And his blood was sprinkled for us.